And what makes markets function is data. And what did I do when trading natural gas or power or oil? I obsessively tracked what every molecule of gas was doing across every pipeline at all times of the day and night, and every day I had a view of the balances, because that is what was going to shift pricing. And there's the path to the clearing price, and there's the kind of ultimate, the ultimate price. But essentially, the ultimate price is always determined by these fundamentals. And I knew that I could, at the very least, do that. And so I, at that point, said, OK, great, this is now going to be a markets and a data problem, and I want to come do this in Africa. What happened is that everyone has created their own language and their own systems for how they view it, and none of it can be connected and compared very quickly. So to answer a pretty basic question ends up taking somebody 5, 6 weeks and 4 people to understand, when in reality, systems can help us understand these things in like 2, 3 minutes. And so I knew that's the company we needed to build. So started basically saying, let's figure out all the sources that exist around Africa that have been collected through the decades. Let's see what format they sit in, and let's create a new language. Literally a new language whereby we have to transform all of this data to our language so that at least you create some universal language that everybody can understand and the whole system can sit on. A corn yield model that can predict corn yields at a county level every 8 days throughout a growing season. And that's basically used by, that's only possible because we've been able to connect dots between satellite imagery, economic data, environmental data from other sources, and then point data. And understanding kind of the confluence of that and basically being able to predict the future is as important as understanding the past. So, Kenya and East Africa as a whole has gone through a pretty drastic economic boom. And economic growth has presented a lot of agricultural opportunities, but also is being challenged by environmental realities. And this is the point that I was making around when I asked the question of, do you have crop insurance? And people say they're thinking about it. It really scares me. So first thing is, this is the land piece of it. It's called the West Side Story. I was recently looking at annual rainfall values across Eastern Africa. So how much rain does Eastern Africa receive by county, by district? And then the next map looks at where's farmland actually located. And if you look at the shades of green on the map where the farmland is located, the darker the green, the more dense the farmland is. So it's percentage of cropland per kilometer squared. So this is something that's basically estimated and computed. Now, there's 2 interesting things you see. One is, the further west you go across Eastern African countries, the more rainfall they actually get. So the darker you see it. And obviously, they're highly correlated with where existing farmland is today. Now, there's a glaring gap, which is actually South Sudan, which essentially has very little farmland. But from a health standpoint and precipitation and rainfall and ability to do rain-fed agriculture, it's one of the healthiest. Someone in Indiana once said to me that when he went to visit the southernmost tip of South Sudan, he realized it's the only place in the world left with this much contiguous land that is of the quality that the Corn Belt was 200 years ago. The Corn Belt is actively producing today. That, no one's doing anything with it today. So, economic growth. So this is just East Africa's growth story. This is looking at GDP per capita in Ethiopia, Kenya, Rwanda, Tanzania, and Uganda. And as you can see, obviously, the green line is Kenya here. So I'm going to slip through these very quickly. However, you have unemployment problems and a growing population. So I'll start with the chart on the right, which is actually looking at the split between the rural and urban population over time in Kenya, and then the decline in the unemployment rate that's actually been happening. So your left axis is the percentage of unemployment rate. Your right is the population broken down by urban versus rural. Now, when you break down the unemployment story into gender, what you end up seeing is a much, much higher unemployment rate for women than for men. So I always say averages are very dangerous to look at because they don't ever tell you the full story. So you want to always use the, start with the macro picture, but always kind of dive deeper to get to the bottom of what happens. So what opportunities in agriculture did this present, and what has happened? Some are longer term. So these are the world's top 5 tea producers. Kenya is currently number 3. Now, it's number 3, but it's far behind India and China. So the question becomes, is there greater potential ahead? Right? So is this kind of, it's obviously grown, but on a relative basis, still seems like it could have room to go, or there's room to play. But when you look at it relative to other East African countries, it's massively dominant in tea, right? So looking at it versus other East African countries, Kenya emerges as, it started in the same place in the 60s. So it was not, it's by design and through investment that this happened. When you look at Kenya's agricultural exports, obviously tea dominates. Now, you're starting to see the emergence of things like beans, and I had no idea that pineapple juice was a real export item until I developed this tree map that gives you a relative sense of what's big. Then the next one is milk. So, one thing I always laugh about is one of our biggest expenses in the office is daily milk consumption. I don't like milk, so. But looking at, this is looking at milk consumption in Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda, and the total population. Now, when you look at consumption per capita in Kenya, it is over 2.5 times that of Tanzania. Kenyans drink a lot of milk on a relative basis. And this, by the way, if you drew this chart relative to any African country, it's on the top. The love for milk, though, has led to much greater efficiencies. This is looking at the quantity of milk cows relative to how much milk is processed. So if you see Kenya, you're seeing a smaller green circle relative to a larger blue circle. That means basically smaller quantity, larger volume is much higher milk yields. That's literally been driven by the fact that there's so much demand. So sometimes demand does force and drive efficiency in markets. Then, nyama choma. This is looking at meat per capita consumption numbers across East Africa. Kenya has always been at the very top on a relative basis. Now, there has been a decline, and we have to figure out why. What's been taking its place? And this is just another view which gives you a sense of beef cattle relative to cattle, the consumption of meat. And then maybe it's the cake. And this is potentially one of the most alarming charts I came across, which was looking at wheat and wheat demand in Kenya. The green line that you see is just your GDP per capita. The blue and red bar charts that you see are consumption is blue, and red is imports. Essentially, the entire growth in demand is being met through imports. There's very, very little change in domestic supply that's occurring to actually meet the demand that's coming. And this is a known thing, which is the substitution into wheat comes with economic growth, right? And the next becomes, again, when protein demand comes, things like soybeans, et cetera, and soy meal become massive feedstock. So most of this wheat today comes from Germany, Poland, Russia, and the Ukraine. And with really Russia and the Ukraine as the two leaders. Your chart on your right gives you the world's 5 top producers of wheat. So a lot of that, though, a lot of wheat producers are actually consuming the wheat they produce, so very little of it makes it to export markets. One of the exceptions is Australia. So the question becomes could wheat surpass maize? This is actually looking at consumption of maize versus wheat in Kenya, and you can just see the slope since basically the early 2000s in the line of wheat consumption and what's occurred. So what's Kenya's opportunity for wrangling wheat? When you look at wheat yields in Russia and Ukraine, Ukraine has much higher yields than even Russia, but Kenya's yields actually match that of Russia. Where the problem lies is the cost. That blue line is the producer price of wheat produced in Kenya, and the green and red lines are wheat produced in Russia and Ukraine. So if the cost problem doesn't get addressed, then it's actually still going to be uncompetitive, and it will still make more sense to import wheat. Now, with all this said, there are massive environmental challenges that are being presented, and in a way and in a rapid scale that are somewhat scary and need to be proactively managed. So weather does determine outcomes. This is a map just looking at Kenya, and this is actually derived from satellite images. And so what we do is we take images at a 250-meter resolution every week. And from those images, we're able to detect the health of vegetation and crop. From there, we can then compute values that actually just detect which areas are healthier than normal and which areas are under duress. So essentially what you're seeing here on a map is taking those 250-meter resolution images, aggregated to the county level, because things are oftentimes managed at the county level. What you see in white is completely normal, and then the more orange it gets, the more distressed the crop is. The greener it gets, the more healthy it is. So the chances of the yield being higher that year is that. So what these three look at is the month of April in 2009, 2010, 2011. At the bottom, you have planting, growing, and harvest seasons in Kenya. There's 2 cropping seasons. And what's really important to note is if you see the intersection of the brown and the yellow line, that's the intersection between the first and the second crop. So as harvest is occurring, planting is starting to occur during, planting is starting to occur for the next season. This, I just realized this is actually water, which is another resource we look at. So this is water availability in the actual soil. So this is water distress, which is associated with yield, which I'll walk to the yield thing next. But essentially, you see that in 2009, there was distress. 2010 looked very healthy and a bumper crop. 2011 looked distressed. You're getting these images live. Good weather brings the bumper crops, which you actually see in the numbers as they get reported. Stable weather brings steady yields. But if you remember the 2009 and 2011 story, you actually see that. Drop, up, back down. And then you see a certain level of stability happening. Now, the green line is showing you the actual maize yields, and the blue line is showing you the amount of rain that it had received. So the country, on average, had received. But again, you can actually do this by the county. You can do this down to a specific location. But you see very high correlations between understanding environmental weather and yields. And you can oftentimes assess environment on a real-time basis. It's very hard to assess yield on a real-time basis, especially if you're trying to do it across a country or across a region. And what you do see is that trade picks up when yields drop. So on years where you see a drop in yield, you'll see the bar chart popping up, which is how you make up for the decline in domestic supply. So being able to predict a drop in domestic supply is absolutely critical to managing trade and setting trade policy. Now, 2017, there's another looming threat in Kenya, which is the army worm. And this is, I put this in largely because it's actually relevant to today. But the army worm actually is native to tropical agriculture. It started in South America, was first discovered in South Africa. South Africa was able to largely kill it off for 2 reasons. One is they used GM seeds, genetically modified seeds, which can fight it off. 2 is the weather cooperated in a way such that it was cool enough and wet enough. Zambia, it had spread to Zambia, which does not allow GM seeds, suffered a bit, but again, the weather was quite cool and wet. So Zambia, the worms essentially died. East Africa is where it's spread to now, and it doesn't look pretty. And the reason is it's actually been very hot, coming into the season. And dry. The rains are starting now, but it's a little too late. So this is actually looking at crop health. So this is the 250-meter resolution image, looking at every 250-meter plot, actually in Kenya and Uganda, because those are the two most affected right now, and saying which areas look like they're potentially distressed. 2017 looks like it could be a very, very tricky year if enough is actually not invested in pesticides, essentially. That's the only thing that could kill it off at this point. To give you an example, this map is February of 2017, which, when you look at your growing seasons, is actually critical. However, this is what the map looked like in February of last year. So this is comparing the field at exactly the same time relative to the same history so that it's completely normalized. And this is one thing that is worth probably addressing. So anyway, that's what we do at Gro. These charts are not manually created. They're actually created through our software. Every single chart you saw, that whole presentation together took 15 minutes maximum. The whole thing. And if you wanted to do and create that manually, it would take, in today's terms, probably 15 to 20,000 hours of basically time. And specialists, because now you need to have the crop science specialist and you have to have the trade market specialist. And what we really care about is bridging those gaps together and making it accessible via the web in a way and using a language that everybody understands.